Picture the Roman world in the dying decades of the 3rd century after Christ. The glory of Augustus, of Hadrian, of Marcus Aurelius, the golden age of imperial stability and Pax Romana, has receded into memory. In its place stands something altogether darker and more volatile, an empire that in 50 years has cycled through 26 emperors, most of whom died violently, most of whom were raised to the purple by their own armies, and then killed by those same armies when fortune turned. The period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, running from 235 to 284 AD, nearly destroyed the greatest political structure the Western world had ever known. The military legions, stationed along the Rhine and the Danube, along the Persian frontier and the edge of the Saharan desert, had discovered a terrible truth. The emperor they made, they could also unmake. A general who commanded the loyalty of enough soldiers could march on Rome and claim the throne. The result was a half-century of near-continuous civil war, with different claimants holding different portions of the empire, sometimes simultaneously, fighting each other while external enemies. The Sassanid Persians in the east, the Gothic tribes pressing across the Rhine and Danube in the north, exploited every moment of Roman distraction to raid, plunder, and occasionally occupy imperial territory. Into this chaos came pestilence. The Antonine plague of the 2nd century had already killed millions. The plague of Cyprian, which ravaged the empire from approximately 249 to 262 AD, may have killed 5,000 people per day at its peak in Rome alone. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms that scholars have variously attributed to smallpox or a hemorrhagic fever: vomiting, diarrhea, blackened extremities, bleeding from the eyes. The empire's manpower was devastated. Farms went untended, tax revenues collapsed, military rosters went unfilled. The administrative machinery of civilization ground to something approaching a halt in the most heavily affected regions. The economy compounded the suffering. Debasement of the currency, the systematic reduction of the silver content in imperial coinage to fund military expenditures, had produced something recognizable to modern economists as hyperinflation. Prices rose so sharply that the traditional economic networks of the Mediterranean world were disrupted. Trade contracted. Cities that had thrived for centuries began to shrink. The grand public works that had characterized the height of Roman civilization, the roads, the aqueducts, the baths, the amphitheaters, went unrepaired. The 3rd century Roman Empire was a civilization consuming its own foundations. It was against this backdrop of military chaos, economic crisis, and demographic catastrophe that the question of religion became, for Roman emperors, not merely a matter of personal piety but of political survival. The Roman religious tradition held that the prosperity of the state depended upon the proper relationship between the Roman people and their gods, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. When catastrophe struck, the natural conclusion of the Roman mind was that the gods were angry. When the gods were angry, someone had to be found responsible. And in an empire increasingly penetrated by foreign cults and novel religious movements, the Christians, who refused to sacrifice to the imperial gods, who refused to burn incense before the emperor's image, who met in private homes and spoke of a kingdom that was not Caesar's, were an obvious target for imperial wrath. But who exactly were these Christians that the empire viewed with such suspicion? They were a far larger community than popular imagination suggests. By approximately 300 AD, historians estimate that perhaps 10% of the Roman Empire's roughly 50 million inhabitants, somewhere between 4 and 7 million people, identified themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. They were geographically dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, concentrated in the cities but present in remote provinces. Socially, they crossed every boundary: slaves and senators, merchants and soldiers, Greek-speaking philosophers in Alexandria and Latin-speaking artisans in Carthage, fishermen's families in Galilee and aristocratic women in Rome. The faith had survived 3 generations of intermittent persecution through a combination of extraordinary social cohesion, rigorous intellectual engagement with the ideas of the age, genuine and widely noticed charitable care for the poor, and the testimony of its martyrs. The religious landscape surrounding these Christians was not a single landscape at all. It was a teeming, restless bazaar of competing devotions, a marketplace of the sacred in which dozens of cults competed simultaneously for the loyalty of human souls desperate for assurance in an unstable world. The old Roman pantheon, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Neptune, the ancestral gods of the Republic, still commanded public ritual and political allegiance. No senator took his oath without invoking them. No general marched to war without consulting the augurs. The great temples on the Capitoline Hill still received their offerings on the appointed feast days. But alongside the old gods, newer and more intensely personal faiths had been spreading throughout the empire for generations. The cult of Isis, drawn from Egypt, had penetrated the cities of the Mediterranean world with her promise of personal resurrection and the compassion of a divine mother who could not be extinguished by death. The devotees of Cybele, the Great Mother, offered ecstatic union with the divine through trance and ritual. The followers of the Syrian sun god had briefly seen their deity elevated to the supreme position in the Roman pantheon under Emperor Elagabalus in the early 3rd century, a short-lived but instructive experiment in solar monotheism. Throughout the military camps of the empire, from the Persian frontier to the Wall of Hadrian in northern Britain, a mystery religion of Persian origin was spreading with quiet, disciplined intensity. The cult of Mithras, whose devotees gathered in underground temples called Mithraea, shared sacred meals that bore remarkable resemblance to the Christian Eucharist, passed through 7 grades of spiritual initiation, and worshipped a solar deity who conquered darkness through the sacrifice of a cosmic bull. Mithraism was, by the late 3rd century, the most formidable spiritual competitor that Christianity had within the Roman military establishment. Its theology was deeply solar. Mithras was identified with Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the divine light that overcomes all darkness. Emperor Aurelian, who reunited the fractured empire after the worst of the 3rd century crisis, elevated Sol Invictus in 274 AD to the position of supreme protector of Rome. He built a grand temple to the sun god on the Campus Martius in Rome, the most sacred religious ground in the city, established a dedicated college of priests to serve it, and stamped the image of the radiant, unconquered sun on the imperial coinage circulating throughout the realm. The theological language of solar supremacy, Sol Invictus, Dies Solis, the day of the sun, the unconquered light, became the ambient spiritual vocabulary of late Roman imperial culture. When, a generation later, a young officer named Constantine began his climb toward imperial power, this was the religious air he breathed. The sun was sacred. The sun was the emperor's divine companion. The sun was the visible symbol of unconquerable divine power in a world that very badly needed unconquerable power of some kind. Understanding this solar theology, understanding it not as an antiquarian curiosity, but as the living faith of an empire, is essential to understanding why Constantine's Sunday law named the day after the sun, and why that naming was not accidental.